Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 2. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 31, which involves an introduction to property, personal property, and fixtures. So, what we're looking at in this chapter in terms of the overall learning objectives, understand the difference between personal property and other types of property, understand how rights and personal property are acquired and maintained, and then also how some kinds of personal property can become part of the real property, sometimes referred to as fixtures. And so that's going to be the overall focus for this chapter. When we're talking about property, just in its very general sense, the restatement of law of property defines property as it's a legal relationship between persons with respect to a thing. Excuse me. So we're not talking about necessarily real property, so we're not talking about that relationship that you or I might have with like owning like a house or land, but we're talking about things that are like movable, personal, tangible property. So property is this legal relationship, and it's the power of one person to use objects, and it's also the power to exclude others from property. So if you have a personal computer, it's yours. You own it. You can exclude others from it, or you can share it. You can use it, or you take a hammer to it and destroy it. It's your property. That's part of your bundle of ownership rights that you have. Can use it. You can possess it. You can sell it. You can do nothing with it. You can destroy it. You can throw it out. Whatever you want, because it's property that belongs to you. So when kind of comparing real versus personal property, in terms of just trying to kind of understand this distinction, if we're talking about like for sale or transfer, general contract law governs real property, whereas UCC Article 2 governs personal property. And we talked a little bit about personal property back in Business Law 1 when we first introduced the topic of Article 2 of the UCC. Upon death, both real and personal property are distributed as per will. If it's intestate, meaning no will, then state law governs how that real property is going to be distributed. I can't emphasize enough the need for everyone to have a will. You want things, the things that you've worked towards in your life. Think of all the possessions you have. Car, furnishings, jewelry, things, mementos, things that are important to you, things that are valuable to you. If you die without a will, the state has a formula for how things get distributed, and you may not want property to go as per that state formula. And so a will goes outside what the state requires, and you can give things however you want. You can give all of your worldly possessions to a charity, for example. You don't have to give it to children or heirs. That's entirely up to you. It's your property. You own it. And so I can't emphasize that enough. Make sure you have a will. For taxation purposes, laws pertaining to valuation, depreciation, and enforcement, they're different. There's different standards that gets applied for real versus personal property. And so that's always something that you have to factor in, when there's like potential tax implications. So when we talk about real property, that obviously includes land, buildings, fixtures, and it could include rights in other people's land. That isn't necessarily ownership rights, and I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. But normally land is anything, more than just the surface of the earth. It could be the soil. It could be things that are permanently affixed to the ground. It could also include things beneath the surface. Maybe you buy a parcel of land and then you find out, at some point in the future, there's oil there. Well, that oil goes with the land. That would be part of the overall value for your property. Uses of land that do not involve ownership. And so I have like a brief listing here. So easements, that's the right to use another portion of someone else's land for whatever the purpose is. So that could be maybe you're an adjacent property owner. Maybe you need access to your property by crossing over a parcel of land to get to yours. Sometimes property is landlocked. We try and avoid that, but it still happens from time to time. Profits is the right to take part of the soil or produce of another's land. So you can segregate or separate out, something that is inherently valuable that's part of the land. Let's say oil. So I could have, let's say I could own, 50 acres of land, let's say in Texas. And under my land is all this oil. And on top of the land, I have a ranch. So I've got, a house, I've got, maybe a barn, I've got a fenced in area, I've got cattle, I've got whatever. And so I can contact, a company that specializes in oil extraction, and I can negotiate with them and say, look, you guys can take all the oil you want off my property. I don't want to do it. You do it, and you pay me so much per barrel. And that's just that would be like a profit. They get to be able to take that, and then they sell it. They give me whatever we agree to per the contract, and then everybody's happy. They don't own the land at all. They don't own the oil per se. They just own it as they take it out. Licenses, that gives someone a privilege to use land for some specific reason. And then there's liens. That's claim on land that is designed to secure a debt. So that could be, examples of that could be a mortgage, it could be a second mortgage, it could be a prime equity line. A lot of different ways in which you can attach a lien to property to satisfy a debt that a debtor has incurred. When we talk about different types of property classifications, so there's tangible, so that obviously is things that, or are things, I should say, that are physically existing in this world that you can touch, see, feel. So car, a computer, a desk, a building, all that stuff is tangible. Intangible are non-physical things. So intellectual property, stocks, bonds. I mean, you might have paper, like evidence of a stock or a bond or IP, but the idea of like a patent, that's a intangible thing. It just is out there, the idea of it. Public property, that's any property that's owned by land, and that could be tangible or intangible. Private is anything that's owned by non-governmental entities, so us as individuals or maybe a business, partnership, sole proprietorship, corporation, LLC, LLP, all the different variations of business entity forms. Real is, immovable land and structures on it. Personal is movable, as we talked about before. So this, just to kind of go through some basic classifications for property types and descriptors of property. So different ways in which you can acquire property. So by possession, generally the power to exclude others from using whatever the property is in question. The question I have there is, what about wild animals or property or abandoned property? And, we talked about in Business Law 1, the idea of like lost versus abandoned property, if you remember that conversation. And if let's say if personal property is truly abandoned, and it's apparent in terms of the factual setting that it's abandoned, as soon as you grab it, it's yours and you become the new owner. You don't need to do anything special. It's yours. So the classic example that I always give in Business Law 1, and if you've had me before, you may remember this, is on garbage day, whether it's in a housing development or in an apartment community or anywhere. If people take things and put them out on the curb or put them in the dumpster as garbage, it's abandoned. Nobody wants garbage back. And so, like I've seen this in apartment settings, it's usually like on moving day when people are either moving in or moving out. Sometimes people put gently used things in the garbage area. It could be lamps, a couch, an old TV, an old computer, whatever. And as soon as they walk away, they've abandoned it. And so if you come by and pick up, let's say, a used TV or an old couch, it's yours. And even if the owner changes their mind and comes back and looks for it, it's a done deal at that point. That ship has sailed. So, again, that kind of feeds into the next point there about finding lost or misplaced property. If you find property of value in a different setting, then more likely it's going to be considered lost. So if you find, a diamond necklace in a parking lot, I find it highly unlikely that someone just decided to take the diamond necklace off and drop it on the ground and walk away. That's not something that people normally do. And so your obligation is to return it to the managing authority of where it was located. So if it's a mall parking lot, take it to the security office. If it's in a parking lot at Walgreens, take it into the manager, and then they have the burden of trying to see if they can relocate or reconnect, I should say, the lost property with the owner at that point. A gift is a voluntary transfer of property, and again, from Business Law 1, if you remember, there's inter vivos gifting, and then there's also causa mortis gifting. And so inter vivos is where you or I, as just living entities, want to transfer property from one person to another just by saying, here, I'd like you to have this. Causa mortis is where you have this contemplation of death. And with the contemplation of death, so just remember with causa mortis, in contemplation of death, if you give things away, if you don't die, you can retrieve them. You can ask for them back. That's an exception. Normally a gift is a done deal at that point, but causa mortis is the exception. Accession, that's when someone is added to what one already possesses. And so like the owner of a thing or goods, if they get more of that thing, like additional thing, obviously that becomes attached or part of your underlying property that you own. Confusion can occur. This is when goods of different owners are commingled. And so this happens sometimes. You think of like field warehousing, where you have like remote storage of some type of inventory or, good. And if you have other depositors at this storage site of similar goods, things sometimes get mixed up. And so it can be very difficult how to figure out, well, who does this belong to? Now, if it's truly all like a commodity type good, like it's all the same, it doesn't really matter then. But sometimes it does matter. If it's, let's say it's livestock, someone's herding all this cattle, and they're herding cattle for different owners, different ranchers, let's say for some reason. You're going to want to tag or mark all the inventory or the animals that are yours, so that if they do kind of get commingled and get mixed up, we can get it back to the rightful owner at that point. So property acquisition, sometimes there's a lot of different things that can arise that can cause confusion for the owners. When we talk about fixtures, remember a fixture is essentially, it starts off as personal property, but then it becomes attached or associated with real property in a way that it becomes part of the real property. So maybe I have, just plywood, just stacks of plywood, and that in and of itself is personal property. It's like it's movable, it's tangible, it's just there. If I'm a cabinet maker, and let's say I take all this wood and I make cabinets in a kitchen for someone, well, those cabinets then become fixed or attached with the real property, and then so that becomes part of the real property at that point. If we're looking at, well, I want this property back even though it's attached, courts will look at three different ways in which personal property becomes fixtures. There's this idea of annexation. So if it cannot be removed without materially damaging the real property or the personal property, the courts are going to say it's part of the real property. So, maybe the cabinets I can disassemble and it doesn't cause any damage. That's unlikely because cabinets, it's a big deal to kind of install them. So if the only way by removing the cabinets, if I tear them up and I tear the wall up of the house, the courts are going to say I don't have a right to them. That has become part of that real property. It's now a fixture. Adaptation is where personal property is especially adapted or modified for use with the building or the structure that it's attached to. So again, if you're customizing something, that's taking personal property and tweaking it in a way so that it's adapted for that specific building, most likely it's going to be considered a fixture at that point. And then intent. We can always look at the intent of the person who affixed it, and we're trying to discern at the time it was installed, when it was personal property and then became attached to real property, what was the intent? Intent might change, but with the intent method, we're looking at the moment that it was installed. Was that intended to run with that property permanently or not? So, and again, there are variations, but, some generalized types of personal property that can be considered part of the real property. Landscaping, curtains and rods, kitchen cabinets, those are just a few examples. You can see how, like landscaping, for example, it might not be a fixture that's permanent. Maybe you just planted some small shrubs or flowers, and you can easily dig that up and then not kill the plant and fill the hole in and cover it with grass, and so no one would ever know it was there. So it is possible to remove it. But if you're talking about like a big oak tree, that has been there for years, you're not going to transplant it because you're probably going to kill it. And then you're going to have this huge crater, in the front yard, at least initially. That's probably going to be a situation where a judge will not let you take that from the property at that point. The last slide that we're looking at here are tenant fixtures. And so let's say that, you're a tenant, so you're renting, you're not necessarily the owner of the property. Normally these fixtures remain with the tenant. Again, it varies depending on the particular situation, but there are trade fixtures. This is where maybe the tenant, in order for them to carry on a business or trade, maybe you're leasing garage space, and so you've put some things in there, and it's kind of adaptive for what you do as a business, but if you can remove it, then okay, that's fine. Agricultural fixtures, that enables a tenant to carry on farming activities. Domestic fixtures, that's anything like residents do or individuals that maybe make, your life a little more comfortable on the premises. Again, removal of any of those things, it has to be installed for one of those stated purposes, trade, agricultural, or domestic purpose. It has to be removed without causing substantial damage to the landlord's property. And then it has to be removed before the tenant returns possession of the premises to the landlord. So if you let's say you add some shelving in an apartment, and then you leave the apartment, and then 6 months later you're like, oh, I want that shelving back. Well, you abandon it at that point, and so you're not going to be able to recover that. If you want that shelving, take it with you before you leave, and make sure you don't cause any damage to the structure. Anyway, these are just some very unique examples that arise when we're talking about personal property and how it could possibly intersect with real property. If you have additional questions, as always, please feel free to message me anytime. You can call, text, or email, and I'd be more than happy to get back with you as soon as possible. As always, please be safe and have a good, productive rest of your day and week. Thank you so much.